And welcome back. We are now going to go ahead and add a little bit more to our game. Let's go ahead and add the ability to add some projectiles in here. And so for that, I went ahead and imported this arrow sprite, and I went ahead and set that up with my pixels per unit being set to 32. So that should give me a nice good starting size for this. But before we go ahead and really animate this in here, let's go ahead and look at our player object. I'm actually going to go ahead and right into the prefab here. And what I want to do is actually set this up so I can edit this player here. Now I'm going to hide this one gizmo here just because it's a little bit in the way, so I'm just going to uncheck 3D icons just so that way I can see just a little bit more of the player here so I can kind of work with this. And what do I want to do with this player? Well, I want to have an area where I know these projectiles are going to come out. Now, of course, later I can animate the player to make that all look nice, but I want them to effectively come out, let's say, from roughly somewhere near here in the middle of my sprite. So to get started, let's first go ahead and create an empty in here. So it's going to give us a child object. And what do we want to call this? Well, you can call this, for example, if you had a bullet, you could call it bullet. If you had, let's say, an arrow, you can arrow. I'm just going to call this projectile for now. I can always rename it if let's say we have different type of projectiles, we can do that as well. But I'm just going to call it projectile just to get started here. Like I said, we can always change that name later if we need to. Now I'm going to want to move this arrow so this flies out at a certain point. Now, if I end up changing where this is coming out, I might want to take a look at my hero sprite because they do have actually a hero animation that kind of has a arrow kind of already loaded up. It's a little different than the arrow I have here, but that's okay because most times that's going to be flying really fast, and I can of course edit that if I need to. But if we look here, we of course have our character is going to have it coming out just a little bit, so I'm going to adjust where this projectile is spawning. Of course, we can do this later, but with further adjustments, but I think this looks like a good rough spot for that to be firing. And of course, if we had this sprite already set up, we can test that. But this is a good spot for this to, at least for now, to get that started with. So that's, of course, where that projectile is going to initialize into the game world and be fired off from. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and just back out and make sure we go ahead and have that overrides be applied if there's nothing in there. So that's good. Even though, of course, we've gone ahead and created that projectile here, we are good to go. Now I am going to collapse this here and go ahead and just bring my arrow on into my hierarchy so we can have that kind of available and ready to go. And what I want to do with this, of course, is to think about what do I need to do with this arrow? What kind of properties am I going to need to get? Well, the first thing I want to do is think about what layers is this going to be part of, right? So we start looking at our layers. We can want to probably put this on our player sorting layer because it's going to be effectively with that player because the player is going to be firing it off. And if we look at our collisions that we're going to do, we're going to need a new layer here. And I'm just going to call this our projectiles. And that should, of course, hold that. So let's just go back to our arrow, make sure we tag that layer with projectiles. Now, because we went ahead and added all these other pieces in here, let's we go back into our project settings, look at our physics 2D, and look at projectiles, and let's just go ahead and uncheck quite a few of these here and think about what do we actually want this to kind of collide with. Now, we probably want to have ground on there. That's good because that's, arrows could run into that. Climbing we don't need. We're not going to be shooting at ourselves, so that can come off. The background we won't need. Bounce we won't need. Enemies, definitely, yes, because we want to be able to target those. The hazards, that might be a good thing to leave there because it gets stuck in the environment. And yeah, we can leave other projectiles on there. All right, cool. So that's set up. All right, so let's go ahead and next make our arrow into a prefab because we're going to use that quite often. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag that on in here. And you can see it now exists. And if I want, I can go ahead and manipulate the different properties of that. So, for example, we can go here to our color here and say, I want to change the color of that. Maybe want to make it a little more blue or something like that. So you can manipulate around that a little bit if you want. Just going to go ahead and let's take it a little more blue. Oh, that looks pretty good. So you can see it's much more blue looking now. Or if you want to kind of keep that much more neutral, you can do that as well. I think that looks pretty good. It just adds a little bit more blue tinge, help match up with that one sprite that we have already pre-made. Now, since this is, of course, going to involve some input, we need to look at our input system. So let's go ahead and open that up. And in here, of course, we have already an action for firing. And you can see right now this is set to our left mouse button. And so that allows us to have that. We look at some other commands, of course, we can see we have like things like WASD moved in here. We have this little command, stuff like that. I'm maybe going to go ahead and add in another command here. Though, for example, if I want to add in a binding, let's say for keyboard and mouse. And what are we going to use? Let's just tap listen. Let's say we want to use the enter key, and let's see, there it is. So now if I press enter, that will also fire that off. I could use spacebar, but of course spacebar right now is set to our jump. So that's just going to be another nice option there, quick and easy for us to be able to use. And don't forget to hit save there, so that way that's applied. And I can always double check that I'm coming into fire and looking to see those options there. So let's pop on back to our code here. Now we of course have methods here that are on move, on jump. And this is going to be, because this is part of our input system, we can go ahead and set up that private void. We're going to do on fire. All right, and that's going to allow us to kind of do that. And now we can go ahead and add some code in here. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to just say return if the player is not alive, because obviously that's not going to be any good to us. And then we of course have to instantiate this code here, right? We need to go ahead and initialize everything so that way it's able to be used for that particular object. And now what are we making? Well, we're making in here, if you call, a projectile. So I'm just going to call this projectile. And of course, we don't have this defined, so we need to go back up to the top of our code here. And in fact, I'm going to start collapsing some of these here just so they're kind of out of the way, because we do have quite a few methods here that we have to scroll through. So just, again, going to collapse some of these so they're kind of more out of the way. We can always open those up later when we need them. But let's go ahead and serialize a field here. And what are we going to serialize? Well, we're going to make a game object. And what is the type? Well, it's going to be a projectile that we're going to need to make here. Now, it's not enough to simply have the projectile exist. We also need to serialize in here one more thing, which is going to be the transform that we're going to use for that projectile. So let's just call this projectile. And we can, of course, give it something like, let's just say projectile transformation or projectile transform. All right. Because again, that's just an obvious reference to what we're using. So let's scroll on back on down to our on fire here. We're going to go ahead and, even though we've had the projectile defined in here, we need to add a little bit more information. So for example, we have that projectile transform, and we need, of course, to get some information about that. So we need to get the position of that transformation, and we're going to want to get the transform of the rotation, right? Because we also need to know where is that object position here. So those are the three things we kind of need to handle: what it is, where it is, and how is it moving, sort of thing. Hopping back over to Unity, let's head back to our player, because remember we did add some new things to it here. So I'm just going to go down into my player movement script, and you can see we have projectile none, projectile transform none. So we need to address those. So for a projectile, since that's a game object, we're going to go to our prefabs. And in this case, this is my arrow, so I'm going to go ahead and drag over the arrow. And remember, the transform is saying, where is that spawning from? Well, if you remember our player, we created this projectile component of it. So I'm just going to say, hey, I want you to use this projectile component to tell me where is that arrow spawning at. So that's, of course, good information that we need to have there for this animation to actually work the way we want to. So now that that's all set up, let's go ahead and give things a run just to see what is happening here. And so here's our player. And so remember, we have a couple options. We can press enter. Oh, there's an arrow. Let's go ahead and jump. Oh, there's some more. I can also click my mouse, and you can see we got all these arrows just spawning into our world. You can see they're cloning themselves right in here. But of course, we're not destroying them. They're not flying across screen. But this is a good start here for being able to get these to appear in here. And again, it's looking a little cluttered, looking a little crazy. But this, again, is a great start for what we want to do.